When I was around 11, I was at softball practice, and for whatever reason, the practice ended early, so I had to wait at the park for my grandpa to come and pick me up. I ended up having to wait alone for about 30 minutes because I didn't have a cell phone to call and tell my grandpa that practice ended early. I remember sitting on the swings when an adult man in his 30s or 40s came and sat down next to me. He asked if he knew me, and I said no, and he told me that I must just have one of those pretty faces that feel recognizable to anybody. I remember feeling happy about the compliment, and I kept talking to him. Eventually, he told me that he had his car with him and that he could drive me home to my grandparents' house so that they didn't have to worry about picking me up and I wouldn't have to wait any longer. Being 11, I didn't think anything of this and proceeded to get into this stranger's car. Luckily, my grandpa showed up just in time, and I remember seeing his car and jumping out to meet him. The stranger sped off without talking to my grandpa, and that was the last I ever heard about it. This is such a vivid memory for me, and I often find myself thinking about what would have happened to me and what a different person I would be today if my grandpa hadn't shown up when he did. When I was in the early years of secondary school, probably 12, 14-ish, my mom asked me to take a bag of sugar over to my elderly neighbor's house as she'd lent us some sugar the previous weekend. Being a bit bratty, I didn't want to take it as I didn't feel like interacting with anyone, but I took it anyway. Stood at my neighbor's front door, timber frame, frosted glass panel in the middle, and knocked. Saw her walking down the hallway to the door and decided that I really didn't feel like chatting. So rude of me, but anyway. So I put the bag of sugar on the doorstep and legged it back to my house. Obviously didn't say anything to my mom about leaving without talking to the neighbor. 3 days later, my neighbor pops around to our house and asks if we noticed anything strange around our house in the last couple of days. Naturally, my mom says, "Oh, honeybee went and dropped the sugar to you. I thought you'd have spoken then." So I was caught out and had to explain that I'd rudely dropped the sugar and essentially ding-ding, edit, ding-dong, ditched. Neighbor goes on to explain that 3 days ago, her alarm was triggered and her house was robbed. She had been interstate and forgot to let us know. It wasn't her walking down the hallway to the front door, but the people burgling her home. Sometimes your intuition speaks to you in weird ways, but that day I just did not want to talk to anyone, and I still think about how lucky I am that I bailed when I saw that figure walking down the hallway. Who knows what could have happened? In my teens and early 20s, my best friend and I used to have lots of sleepovers. His mom worked the night shift as a nurse, and his little brother usually stayed in his room and went to bed early, so we had the house for ourselves. We'd cook, eat dinner together, watch TV, and especially talk a lot. We also had a tradition that we called night walks. Always around 11 p.m. or midnight, we'd leave the house and go for a long walk, 2 to 3 hours. It was especially nice in the summer because the air was warm, but there was a coolish breeze and the fields and pastures smelled amazing. There was one particular route we walked very often. Towards the end of it, there was a big forest that we had to cross, and when we emerged from it, we were on a hill that overlooked the city. There was a bench, and sometimes we sat down to enjoy the silence, the distant lights, and to relax a bit before going downhill and home again. One time we did exactly this. Walking through the forest was always a bit scary in the middle of the night, so once we got out, my friend suggested to rest on that bench for a few minutes. We left the trail, walked 20 miles across a meadow, and finally got to the bench. The bench was located in a place where it was surrounded by trees and bushes, except in the front where you had a great view. We sat there for maybe 20-25 minutes, had a smoke, and just talked about random stuff like space and philosophy. At one point, my friend remarked that he was getting cold because this happened in late fall, October or November. So we decided to get going and walk home again. When we were almost back to the trail, my friend asked me if I had brought the lighter. I told him that I thought he had picked it up. We turned around and went back to the bench. For a while, we just kind of touched around on the wooden surface, but couldn't find it. Since this spot was mostly surrounded by trees, it was very dark. My friend took out his phone and turned on the flashlight to find the lighter. He waved the flashlight around, and that's when we saw him. There was a guy sitting right behind the bench, like maybe 2 pounds, 6 foot. He was completely dressed in black and sat there motionless on the cold, wet ground, just staring at us. We hadn't heard any noise, which means he must have sat there for the entire time while we were sitting on the bench, just staring at the back of our heads. That alone is super creepy to think about still today. Of course, my friend and I both got really startled, and my friend said something like, "Holy shit, man, you almost gave us a heart attack, haha. What the hell are you doing there?" But the guy didn't respond anything. For a while, we just stared at him confused, and he stared back at us. Then I asked, "Why are you sitting there on the ground?" No response. My friend asked, "Are you all right?" Still no response. It was a really surreal situation, but something about it didn't feel good. I can't say what, but something about that guy gave me a really bad feeling in my stomach. My friend later told me that he had felt the same way. Suddenly, the guy got up and began to walk towards us. I said, what's happening?" And now the guy answered, but all he said was, "Yeah." As he walked around the bench to come towards us, I felt my friend's hand grab my coat and pull me backwards. He quietly said, "Let's get the fuck out of here, man." We walked a few steps backwards because we didn't want to turn our back on the guy. Then we turned around, ran back to the trail and another 100 meters. When we turned around, we were relieved to see the guy hadn't come after us, but we still walked home as quickly as possible. To this day, I don't know why the hell that guy was sitting there, who he was, why he was silently staring at us for almost half an hour, what he planned to do when he got up and walked towards us, etc. All I can say is that my gut feeling tells me it was the right decision to run away rather than wait to find out. Used to dispatch call take 911 in a moderately sized city. Was working overnights once, and we started getting tons of calls about UFOs over the area. It was a weeknight in summer, and lots of people out walking or drinking or whatever were seeing this thing. We probably took 100-ish calls about EM. For reference, I might handle 300 or 400 calls myself on a shift. And as the supervisor of that rotation, I took over trying to resolve it so everybody could focus on the typical stuff. We had a hot phone to the airport ATC for air emergencies. Got to use that once for a plane crash. That was fucking terrifying. And they had absolutely no idea about what was going on and actively resisted getting involved. Little while later, got a hold of an FAA hotline, and they definitely had a UFO policy, but were only interested in taking info. They didn't disseminate anything. Talking to them felt like an interrogation, and I left my badge number instead of my name. Eventually got a hold of a duty officer at an Air Force base relatively close by. He told me they were aware of the situation, they were monitoring it, and to consider it a closed issue. Whole thing was a trip. Definitely got vibes like I was an extra in the opening of Independence Day. This was before the days of neighborhood Facebook groups or Yik Yak. The local radio stations had tons of pictures up on their websites for a while afterwards.